Hey everybody, this is Brad Dyke saying hi. I've got this new little trick I'm doing. When I get 100 views on my latest video, I release my next 3 videos. And that seems to work out pretty good. I don't want to saturate the market with just useless videos. I'm not about meeting numbers and things like that. I'd rather be more thoughtful and bring to the table some concepts and ideas that would work. So today this video is about specifically processors. And what does the future look like? And where do I have the gumption to turn around and say I know anything about the future of central processing units as well as other variations of, shall we say, processing? This video is about a logical presentation this time. We're not going to be talking about hardware directly, but more of the logic that allows the hardware to be put into a serviceable role, right? So if anyone has any experience with the old days of 386s, 286s, x86s, and so on, the old styles which were the DIP style chipsets, you would know that there's been a long road for CPUs in the industry. So let me do a quick history report here real quick with you to help you with this. So to understand basically what's happened, you would understand that a long time ago, IBM had this technology that was known as x88, x86 based technology, and they gave the patent away as a sellable item to Intel. And they began the x86 generational chipsets, similar to this one here. And it was the beginning of something really awesome. Now, as the time went, 286s, 386s, 486s, began to come into existence over time. Now, with the math coprocessors and the standalone processors, and then of course, this is my favorite chip, the DX Series 50, the 486 DX50, very powerful chip for its day. And then for those who work with storage technologies and advanced server platforms, the i96, which is also a very competent chip. And then you have other technologies like, for instance, the clock quad effect of the Intel DX4 486, which was also a really awesome chipset. And the introduction of Cyrus CPUs and AMD processors back in the day to directly compete against the 486 series. When that began, we also developed the sense of what's called extended functionalities, known as MMX extensions and many other types of extensions that came into existence, and those became integrated onto the die of the core processor. So at the beginning, you just had a standard processor, and you'd have a math coprocessor on the sideline if you wanted to calculate math. Over time, those components began to interface inside the central chip, and this is just the beginning, because at the introduction of the Celeron style chipsets and of course the classic Pentium style chipsets, we had also what we call the P2 generational SLCs, which are basically circuit board versions of something much more accomplished, my most favorite chip in the whole wide world, the Pentium Pro 6. What an incredible chip. It was also bad news, because when you look at this Pentium chip here, and then you look at this very low-cost silica-style graphite board integration chip, the cost of making these were far less and didn't have the failure rate of these much better quality chips known as the Intel Pro 6s. This is my favorite chip in the whole wide world because it did something incredible, which these chips did not support well at all, and that was they brought on board caching. So on one side is the CPU, and on the other side is a big block of cache, and allowed it to all interact at the CPU level, not at the motherboard bus level. Here we have a cheap rendition, very much like this guy, but cheaper, which is basically the core processor, as you can see here. And then they slapped on 256 cache on the back end. And the bad news about this strategy is they use the motherboard bus right here to communicate and relay the CPU communication to the cache. That made this a piece of junk. It really was. The slot style Pentium 2 was, in my opinion, poor design on every front. Really was not a very good platform at all. Now, with that being said, then we have a series of the P-series processors of different sizes and ZIF socket footprints, starting out with a fairly small format, which, as you see here, no longer do you have the pins. Unlike the 486s and the Pentiums, you have the pins. And as they got bigger, they added more pins, and they even got bigger. As you can see, even more pin outputs to make contact until they get to really large footprints. And again, these pin sockets are not on the chip anymore. They're actually on the motherboard. And these fit perfectly on top of those gold pins to make contact until you get to the most ridiculously large chipsets that are now starting the process of maximizing what is pretty much known as a saturated market. Now I can show you bigger CPU chips. I'm not a fan of the giant ones like the Rippers and all of that, because the truth is, unless you really have a definitive role or requirement to have such a big processor in your environment, these intro-level processors are really the most beneficial because they give you the most bang for your buck when it comes to power and handling and expensive hardware and so on. So I'm going to stick with the strategy of the core CPU technology because there's a problem with CPUs today. The Morres law strategy is basically you can only pack in so much before the heat becomes intolerable. That's true. There's some optimized things at which we can do, such as TEDs. Those are thermoelectric diode strategies that are formulated into the actual tops of the processors to suck heat off more effectively into the heatsink and dissipate heat even faster. But Moore's law eventually takes its toll on the environment. Why? Well, simple. You see this metal? That's why. Metal. You see, heat is derived by the transfer of electrons through the surface areas of the processing stack. And the more cycling you do and the faster you push it, the hotter the environment gets. And you can lower the wattage and the voltage loads, change your clock cycling and so on, but somebody's going to jump in there and they're going to overclock, or they're going to do something because they want to and they can. There's the big secret weapon. Just because they can, they are going to go in there and they are going to push it until it burns out, or just to the edge, which most people do. Moore's law dictates that we have a finite limitation on how we handle our processors today. So what's the future? And how can I talk to this? Great question. The first question is, what's the future? Oh, wow, it's really cool. That's all I got to say. I'll elaborate later. 2, how do I have the ability to even talk to this? Well, that's kind of a double-edged sword. As part of my previous experience in the industry, I had certain clearances and rights that allowed me to initiate and join communities in the IT industry that helped dictate the standard of processing powers, which also gave me the non-disclosure agreements to see what those technologies could potentially become. Now, it's been over 10 years since that, but what I saw then is taking shape now. So nothing is at risk anymore because we're okay on that front. You see, here's the thing you need to know about processing. Let's use this edge card as an example. This is an electrically based designed piece of electronics. Everything that travels data coordinates into the nature of the pathways provided by both the circuit board and, of course, the communication of execution versus memory. Now, the key detail here is all of this copper and gold. This is the Achilles heel that we knew a long time ago was an issue. So with that being said, how can you take this piece of circuitry, this bus, let's call it that, because it is. It's a mini motherboard bus that fits on a motherboard. How ironic. Well, the secret is eliminate the copper, eliminate the gold. Now, you've heard the scientific term that Star Trekkers would say, and it's called isolinear technology. Well, isolinear technology is not too far off, actually. in how to properly support the nature of that next step. And that is using light. That's right. Now, you can't eliminate the processing itself because, the die is on a silica wafer, right? But you can set up a series, if you look here in the back, a series of receivers and transmitters that terminate the process of the processor itself and relates on a communication bus of photons. And not just simple photons, but variance wavelength photons. In other words, 70, 80, 1,000, 2 million wavelengths. Why? Because each one of them can act as a read-only or a write-only pathway for the CPU bus. Now, the Achilles heel today is you're building motherboards that use fiber optic relay communication technology. It's kind of antiquated. Now, you got a transceiver on one end, it's copper, flips it to fiber. On the other end, you got another transceiver, and it's a copper, and it goes back to copper. So copper to copper. The fewer copper pathways, the more efficient your system becomes. This is quite a challenge. That means that the transceivers, which they are, receivers and transmitters, must be very tiny, must be very easy to power, and must literally be the bulk of the level of communication digitally on the motherboard. Now, how do you get a CPU that runs hot to lessen its voltage load if you would have photo emitters on the bottom to tackle that? And by doing that, by adding photo emitters in the actual CPU die of the processor stack itself, it might be something really big like this. But stick with me for a second. There's a value to a big chip, and I'll explain why. You see, when I was looking at things, the very first question I asked is, hey, in our high computational processing computing centers, we constantly fight over availability of RAM resources. And why? Why can't I have one pool of resource we can classify as memory-based resource, and then I dictate if it's going to be read and write or if it's read only? Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means is today on these CPUs, all of them, even if they're fairly recent like this one, they have, and I love using this as an example, a small die of memory or a couple of dies of memory that are focused on L1, L2, L3 caching for the processor. And it has this little communication bus here on these older styles, but in these newer styles, you'll actually see them right there. And they communicate and bridging in the CPU itself, which is excellent. So if we were able to put in photo emitters into the processor, and that means we can remove a third to maybe 2/3 of the electrical requirement processes from the chip itself, then we reduce the overall voltage on the processor. But that would really make this processor cold. That means we might have some room for something else. So when I was telling you, when you look at these chips, this is bigger, more functional, and as you keep going up, they keep getting bigger and so on and so on. And the key detail is if you've got a big die chip, like let's say a Threadripper, and you only put half the core processors in it, and then you put, SSD, or what we call hypervelocity SSD storage, which means hypervelocity means that you could have 2 terabytes of capacity that could sit on the actual CPU, and you can have, let's say 4 gigs of dedicated L1, 4 gigs of dedicated L2, 4 gigs of dedicated L3 cache. You have a 16 gig memory allocation, or a 32 gig allocation, or a 100 gig allocation. You still got plenty of room. And then you build a paired set of capacities there on the system, and by doing that, the remaining of your SSD capacity, which either can be high performance RAM, high performance L-cache RAM, or it can be high performance SSD on the CPU. So how would you like to have one CPU that had all of the capacity you needed, and you had all the RAM you needed, and all of the SSD storage you needed, and all you need now is a small bus interface to connect input-output devices like video cards or, NIC cards and so on into and communicate for this unit. That's right. So, with the ability of integrating fiber optic style like communication busing, which is micro fiber optics or MFC, and it communicates on the motherboard bus that way, opposed to the elimination of many of these other additional pathways. The voltage level of this can be cut in half of what we take away, bring back some of that voltage to power SSD equivalency RAM performance levels. Now, there's one super critical thing about this future technology. It still doesn't exist. So, one thing you've got to remember about RAM. RAM is only good if it's in a paradigm pyramid structure. What do I mean by that? Well, at the top of your game is your CPU. GPUs don't do this. GPUs were never designed to be the central processing coordination bus processor. That's what a CPU is. It must be your top dog, the fastest. And its fastest memory is always L1 cache, every time. Now, there are separate caches inside at the sub-level. Not talking about that. We're talking about functional levels of RAM. L1 must be the fastest. L2 is the second fastest. L3 is the third fastest, if they're still required. Not always are they required. Then you have to take to the next level of RAM, let's say 128 gigs, or 255 gigs, or 500 gigs of RAM. That would fit for all the core processors that need the RAM. You still have a boatload of storage, by the way. Then you have your SSD provisionable RAM. You turn that RAM into SSD RAM by a simple allocation, and that's it. Now, what would probably happen in the industry is they would fixate the capacities of L1, L2, and L3. But they would be substantial, far greater than what we see today. Far greater than what we see today. And that probably the RAM allocations per processors would be static, which means each processor would get 16 gigs or 32 gigs each or something like that. And you have 24 cores. So you can do the math, right? So there's your allocation of RAM. And then, of course, SSD. You only really need 500 gigs of capacity. And you've got that in spades. But, okay, now you're going to ask the question, well, Brad, are you thinking this out right? What about redundancy? Not a problem. We're talking about high-level processors here, which means they're SMPs, symmetric multiprocessing buses. In other words, they have two of them, two processors. So, the very first thing that has to be done with RAM allocations is you have to make the fastest and the slowest, and you have to have your paradigm that will get you up to the fastest from the slowest. That's how things work in the world of CPUs. I don't care if it's a watch or a Pi, Raspberry Pi model, or an Aurora, or a P4, or whatever. That's the nature of the buses. They have to be slower the farther away from the CPU processing. So because of that, the SSD needs to be literally the slowest RAM in the equation so that everything can properly flow up and down to avoid something what we call I/O wait states impacts. I/O wait state impacts basically means that your system has to pause and wait for some things to catch up because you're kind of clogged. You've overfilled because something's faster than the other things. So it's very important to have a hierarchy of how things travel. So when you have a dual processor environment, then you can have fully redundant RAID 1-like communication busing going on between the two processors, linking two block 500 gig allocations or two 1 terabyte block allocations to each other so that you can get everything you want out of it and be fully redundant. How would this be done? Because we have fiber optic integration now. Now, I don't want to call it isolinear because technically that's a Star Trek term. It doesn't really exist per se. Not exactly the way they talk about it. Because in the world of Star Trek, the isolinear chips are pure silicon glass. There is no electronics in it at all for the most part, except for the emitters for light. So with that being said, the next big, huge challenge is, wow, this all sounds great. It sounds doable. Not only doable, it's not far away. And the good news is I can talk about it now because I'm way past my NDA agreements. And many of those technologies have gone on to become other types of technologies down the road. So with being safe in that discussion, I can tell you that this is just the top of the technology form. So that leads us to one more critical CPU-related technology that is coming and is very important. It's physics. We only discovered a few years ago that in the Bible God said, "Let there be light." We didn't get it. That's okay. Let me explain. When we look at these chips, we have a complex level of different atomic masses that are here, ranging from gold to aluminum to silica to graphite to fiberglass and many, many more other chemicals and so on. And the key detail about these is that we have to understand that something has to support all of this, right? Well, what does that mean exactly? What do you mean it has to support all of these different atomic masses? Well, I'll explain. What it means, basically in a nutshell, is all matter in the universe, as we've finally determined, lives on top of a layer of photonic energy. That's right. Photons are the canvas that atomic matter is built on. It's brilliant. It's excellent. It's the good old Lord's way of doing things. Keep it simple, stupid. And it's terribly simplistic, and it works flawlessly. And it really has no imperfections for the most part. If we were to go to a different dimension that didn't have light in it, we wouldn't be around very long because our bodies would react to that environment and it couldn't be sustained, and we would pretty much, I suspect, just start to break down into little tiny subatomic particles. But in the reality of the fact, light is a lot more than we give it credit for. You see, when we look at this hardware, we look at it with light. What we also have to understand is light is actually a source of electrons, or actually, to be more precise, because some people say that electrons don't technically really exist, but there's something electrical that does exist, and they're still working that detail. I can agree with that because there are some discrepancies there about electrons, neutrons, and protons. But the key detail here is light can make it. We know that because we have solar cells that can derive electron energy from sunlight, which means there's more to sunlight than we're aware of. And we're starting to discover that on a very large scale now, and that's important because we can actually be able to have less electronics and more fiber optic-like integration components that are all plastic and glass, and for the most part, the striking of the light hitting the contact points would generate the electrical energy necessary to transition to the next piece of fiber optic equipment. Now, this is a very sophisticated process that's still being vetted very heavily on many different companies out in the world. And I think it's like the 12th generation now. But the key detail about that is it's not ready yet. It's coming. So what does that mean for a futuristic CPU that, how would we say this, that would have 2 terabytes of capacity on it, that provides everything from L1 to CPU RAM, and let's say 1 terabyte of capacity that could be paired up in a RAID 1 tiering with a second processor on the same motherboard. And the limitation is the fiber optic bridging between the 2 processors for the SSD. But we need it slowed down anyways so that everything can flow correctly up and down to the processors so that they can do their job flawlessly and avoid I/O wait states. Pretty impressive stuff, don't you think? Now, I said earlier that through my involvement with different organizations, I had certain levels of clearances and so on, and NDAs and so on, and I was privileged enough to join the Intel HPC Roundtable Committee. I was with them for many years, and I was able to see all the groundwork that was necessary to reach these kind of technologies in the future. Will I be alive when it comes to seeing some of these processors? Maybe. but I probably won't be around when we finally figure out the last components of a fiber-based motherboard versus an electrical-based motherboard. And there are many examples out there, but they're kind of glossy. And red, green, blue motherboards are not fiber optic, by the way. So this is my little logic video that I like to offer to you guys to talk about some of the cool things that are coming and what you could do with them, not to mention all the technology between yesteryear, today, and in the future that you could, I hope, reinvent to doing other things, because you know, it doesn't have to be trash. It can always be recycled and reprocessed if there's an advantage to doing so. So, with that being said, this is Brad Dyke saying God bless and have an awesome week. I'm going to let you go. Bye-bye.